Today's episode of Thoughts, Comments, Opinions is brought to you by Thoughts, Comments, Opinions, actually. We're inviting you to come and look at our archive and maybe even be a sponsor of our show. If you go to www.patreon.com, just type in the little search box, Thoughts, Comments, Opinions, you'll go right to our page. You'll find the archive of all of our podcasts. And if you'd like to, you can sponsor us for as little as $1 a month. We'll put your name in the credits. We'll wish happy birthday to your friends. We'll even let you suggest guests or topics. What could be easier than that? So if you enjoy these podcasts, if they entertain you, if you get information from them, we hope that you'll come along and be one of us. We'll be right back with today's show. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, depending on what time it is, where you're listening. My name is Hubert O'Hearn, and welcome to Thoughts, Comments, Opinions. Today, we're not talking to writers or artists, we're talking about an extremely serious topic. The Middle East, the rise of ISIS. What is it? What is meant to be done about it? Our guest is going to be Professor Fadi Dawood, talking to us from Toronto. You know, I do want to cover some serious topics as well as the wonderful world of art. So if you have an idea for a guest or a topic that you're interested in knowing more about, please comment, please write to us. You can always visit our web pages. The addresses will be seen on the screen at the end. So in the meanwhile, sit back, relax, fire up a martini, and listen to the words as they fly through the air. We'll be right back. Historian specializing in minority populations in Iraq and Syria, Fadi Dawood. Hello, Fadi. How are you?
How are you?
Not too
I'm well.
badly at all.
Good.
So, what we want to do is let the listeners know a bit of the background of what's going on in the Middle East and kind of put life into perspective. Let's start here with, first of all, with ISIS. I hear the terms both ISIS and ISIL. Which one's correct? Is there any difference?
Well, I think both terms are in a way correct. ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, changed its name from ISIL, the Islamic State of the Levant, Iraq and the Levant, to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria last summer, when they actually invaded Mosul in northern Iraq, the city in northern Iraq, and took it over. And those successes, military successes, spurred a name change. Now, why did they do that? There are many explanations, but no one really knows, because they're so, whimsical in a way that they just decided to change their name. I'm not, that's what I can tell you. So both are correct. The other correct name is Daesh, which is the Arabic term for, essentially, roughly translated to barbarian. So the political class and other individuals in the Middle East are calling them Daesh, or barbarians.
Where did it come from? People like Chris Hedges, Noam Chomsky, others say that ISIS was, in effect, a creation of the United States to attempt to destabilize Hafez Assad. Is that correct? Is there anything correct about it? What's your take on it?
I think it is a creation of a number of political situations that have sort of influenced the creation of this state, or this military/political organization. I think what we really have to look at is the real ramp up to the deployment of ISIS as we know it today is the American invasion of Iraq. in northern Iraq, the vast majority of the population is Sunni Muslim, who for the last 80 or 85 years, from the creation of the Iraqi state in 1920 all the way to 2003, had the bulk of power in their hands. And Saddam Hussein and his Ba'athist party were the preeminent example of that. Although they originally came as a socialist or quote unquote pseudo-socialist regime, they actually were Sunni Muslims, and prior to that, the Sunnis ruled in various forms, including the years of the Iraqi monarchy from 1921-22 all the way to 1958 when the revolution occurred. So this group of people had power and had influence in the country. With the arrival of the Americans, this element in society was removed from power, and there was a policy of de-Baathification, or essentially anybody who was associated with the Ba'ath Party or a member of the Ba'ath Party was not allowed to work in government anymore. So the Iraqi army, the Iraqi police forces, teachers, anybody who actually had any association with the Ba'ath Party, for example, teachers, if you worked as a teacher in Iraq, you had to be a member of the party. Not an active one necessarily, but you had to be a member of the party. So all these individuals were all of a sudden unemployed and without really anything to do. They became idle. And the Shia population, which is the majority of the population living in the south, were all of a sudden thrusted into power, and after particularly the first election in Iraq, they actually consolidated it with the help of the Americans, and little talked about the Iranian regime because they actually aligned themselves with Iran due to the Shia connection. And so these northern communities, and particularly in Mosul, they found themselves without power. And so the early seed of this Islamic State began to appear in 2004, 2005 with quote-unquote radical terrorist organizations taking over large swaths of the political local political organizations in Mosul and other northern cities in Iraq. And so there were actually even then many attacks on minority clergies, on minority populations. People were threatened, they were kidnapped, they were killed, money was taken from them. And the biggest example of that is the Chaldean Archbishop of Mosul. The Chaldean Catholic Church is one of the Eastern churches, the four Eastern churches in Iraq. The Archbishop of the Chaldean Catholic Church, Fadi Dawood, was actually kidnapped by radical Muslims while he was driving with his driver and bodyguard in Mosul. And this is, I think, in 2006. And he was taken away, and essentially he was found, his body was found in a dumpster a few days later, and clearly what had been a situation where he was kidnapped and tortured for a few days before he was killed. And other clergy were, the same thing had happened to them, in spite of the many trials or many sort of attempts by the American forces and the Iraqi local forces to stabilize the region. The harms and attacks against minority populations, and even against individuals who were not supportive of these organizations, be it Muslims or Christians. We saw many attacks against them in that period. So, as you can see, it's a history of complexity.
Indeed.
But it seems that in the same time period, external forces like Saudi Arabia and Qatar started to play a role in funding these forces and funding these groups of people in Iraq in order to take hold, over the region and counteract the influence of Iran. Again, the Sunni-Shia divide rears its head again, eventually leading to the creation of ISIS. So ISIS is not something that was just created overnight. It was as a result of long, political fights or political disputes in the region that really materialized in 2003 and culminated in last summer's sort of rise of ISIS.
ISIS, from my understanding of it, is devoted to a fundamentalist form of Salafist Islam. Would you mind describing what that is, how it might differ from what our conventional understanding of Sunni or Shiite Islam is?
Sure. I mean, I'll start by saying that in Islam, and particularly in Sunni Islam, there are, and actually even in Shia Islam, there are a number of schools of thought. However, if we look at the history of these schools of thought, we come to the quick realization that there are varying schools, and particularly varying reformist schools that emerged in the early 1900s to essentially, there are movements that, try to change the way Muslims view their religion and to liberalize it. Essentially, what I mean by liberalizing it is to change the way it is practiced. So we have, great figures like, Muhammad Abdu, Lafani, and Abdu, who actually really tried to change, Jamal ad-Din Lafani, for example, he actually really tried to reform Islam in a way that, drove away from the traditional, quote-unquote, Islam. In the 1800s, although he was a Shia, you had Abdu, who was a Sunni, who really, really wanted to change Islam. However, with the rise of the Saudi state, came a form of Islam called Wahhabism. And the reason why this came is because when Al Saud, the current royal family in Saudi Arabia, when they actually came to power, they were helped by an individual by the name of Wahhab. And Wahhab, whose philosophy called Wahhabism, helped to drive away, the competing interests or competing political, families from the region in order to consolidate power in the hands of the Al Saud family. They actually became the political class became combined or became intertwined with the religious class, and Wahhabism, became a religious movement that became integral to the Saudi state or the success of the Saudi state. And so, as Saudi Arabia became richer, they actually continued to spend money to promote the Wahhabist idea throughout the Middle East. And so Wahhabism is, in a way, a purist form of Islam. They actually claim that any sort of changes to the orthodoxy of Islam and any non-pure interpretation of Islam is a form of blasphemy and a form of state of apostasy from Islam. Now, the Salafists are even a more right-wing or a more conservative view of Islam. And this sort of belief or Salafist beliefs is a word. Salafi is an Arabic word meaning a Salaf, which means the first three generations of Muslims, the people that actually directly came after Muhammad. And this movement is actually ultra orthodox or ultra purists, and they see Wahhabists as left wing and as blasphemers. And so, in some cases they are viewed as synonymous with each other. In some circles they are viewed as competing interests. But really they came out of the same sort of movement Orthodox Islam that Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for that matter, promoted in uh, the period in the late last century and early this century.
It 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 strikes me that there's a certain internal contradiction, and I'll just quote you quickly a passage from the book "The Islamic Phoenix" by Loretta Napoleoni, and in comparing ISIS with the Arab Spring movement, she wrote that modern technology and a clear understanding of how a multipolar world functions, however, are not enough to succeed. Is it possible that the smartphone uprisings, including the Arab Spring, failed where the Islamic State has succeeded because the latter is managed by a professional elite which guides the rank and file, while the former finds itself at the mercy of their constant interaction and participation? If so, is the Islamic State's model of nation building more modern than that of the Arab Spring? Now, here's what strikes me as the internal contradiction in that it's ultra fundamentalist, yet it's very much organized on high technology, high degree of organization, etc. Am I right in seeing a contradiction there, or no?
Oh, I mean, yes and no. I think there is a level of contradiction in the sense that they are using modern technology, particularly in weaponry and warfare. They're using modern technology and using some phenomenal, and I say this, with disdain, but they are using technology to distribute propaganda. I mean, the propaganda machine that ISIS has used is extremely well organized. From the flag that becomes synonymous with them, all the way to the pictures and the YouTube videos that are so gruesome that are posted on YouTube and other social media sites that essentially uses modern technology to promote what they view as a traditionalist view of Islam or a traditionalist view of life that predates modern technology and predates Western influences and predates, the blemishes that the West or even the East has brought to itself or to its borders as a result of interaction with the outside world. So it's a contradiction, but at the same time, it's not really a contradiction. I mean, it's the best form of promotion or the best way to promote this propaganda, and they know that. They know that full well, and they are using it in order to advance their cause. And for the most part, they have been quite successful at doing what they want to do: antagonize the world, promote their ideas to individuals that might actually find interest in their cause, and essentially attract a following from around the world. There's this preference for ISIS now in many parts of the world where people have looked at their videos or looked at their messages online. It just became a way for individuals to connect with ISIS, and also it became a way for ISIS to antagonize the world. I mean, when they destroyed some ancient artifacts in Mosul a few months ago, they used YouTube videos to confirm that they've done so. And I think they did that in order to antagonize the world and say, look, we are still in control of the region, and you can't really do anything about it.
Its goal is the revival of the caliphate, from back in the 7th century. Do you think that they think that that actually might happen? That a nation state would emerge out of this?
Well, I think we should start by saying a nation state is a term we really can't apply to the caliphate.
Okay.
Let's not forget that the words nation and a state imply an idea where you have citizenship. and you have citizens.
Right.
While in a caliphate, you don't really have citizens. You have subjects. And the subjects of the caliph, like any empire that predated the rise of the nation state in Europe or the Middle East, the subjects were really not consulted, or nobody really cared if they were consulted in the political process. And I say that in the sense that, if you're a subject, you have a group of elite, and for the most part, those elite are a combination of politicians and clergy that made the decisions in society, and society had to live with it. So a caliphate really is like any empire that predated the modern nation state. They used power to ensure that they remained in power. So they used essentially violence to ensure that they remained in power when needed. And they amassed as much territory as they could in order to make sure that they were economically, at least for the most part, economically viable as entities. And they had a ruling elite led by a caliph or a sultan or, whatever it is, whose actually authority came divinely from God. And whatever he said, for the most part, was law. And whatever they decreed, everybody followed. And they were unquestioned, divine, because they have that role of speaking to humans as God's messengers on earth. And this is, by the way, what the caliph means. The term caliph means khalifa, which means the successor of Muhammad. And as such, they are the emissary or the messenger of God's word on earth. So it predates this idea of the state and predates the idea of the nation, because the nation and the state brought citizenship. They brought with them sort of ideas of civil society. They brought with them ideas of, equality between individuals living in a state. And as such, individuals became citizens, and they actually had the right, or if not the right, they actually were able to contribute to the political process. And everybody was equal, be it on a theoretical level, everybody was equal. And, the ruling classes were just individuals that were doing the bidding of society at the political level. And so we really can't look at it as a nation state. What they are trying to do is not a nation state. What they are trying to build is somewhat of the best way that I say is, think of empires where you had kings and queens that were anointed by God to rule over a population.
So who then is funding it? Because, and not to trivialize, but armies don't come cheap. Who's funding it, and what is in their interest to keep ISIS going?
Well, who is funding ISIS is a complicated question, because I don't think we really exactly know 100% who is funding ISIS. But we know that, for the most part, from the readings, from our ability to decipher, Saudi Arabia is playing a role in funding ISIS. Qatar has played a role in funding ISIS. Other sort of interests in the Gulf have paid, from private wealthy individuals all the way to states in the Gulf, have paid to fund ISIS because they really want the influence. They want to quell the influence of Iran in Iraq and in Syria, and the best way to do so is to fund ISIS, or at least that's what they figured. Now, who is actually funding ISIS and how the money is flowing to ISIS? One of the best ways to say is oil. ISIS is selling oil. We know that they are selling oil, and the oil is going through Iraqi Kurdistan, and it's going through Turkey, and it's being sold for really, really cheap. And that's how they are getting money. Now that they have been set up and they are sort of on their way to becoming, an entrenched political entity in the region, they are selling oil, and Turkey's buying that oil. Turkey is gladly paying for oil because it's much cheaper than what they can get on the world market.
Although Turkey, has now called NATO conference, and he is talking about getting into active military engagement against ISIS. So here again, it almost seems paradoxical. How is that working?
Well, Turkey is one of those states that is very, very difficult to understand what is going on in Turkey at the moment. I mean, on one end, Turkey has been, especially since the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1923, and subsequent sort of political authorities in the country have secularized the state. They've ensured that the state had no official religion. They ensured that religion was not intertwined to the lives of individuals in the country. And that worked for a long time until the arrival of this current political party to power and this current president to power. And this current government is a form of, essentially, it's a form of, how should I put it, a form of Islamically tinged. They essentially are very similar to the Muslim Brotherhood political party that came to power in Egypt a few years ago. And so, on one end, they are loyal, or they have to show loyalty to Islam and to Muslims around the world. And on the other end, they actually have to seek political survival. And they know full well that ISIS might essentially overthrow the Turkish state, or at least harm the stability of Turkey, by penetrating its borders, or by even bringing supporters from Turkey and training them in Mosul or training them elsewhere in Islamic State holdings and bringing them back to Turkey. And the Turkish-Syrian border is very loosely guarded, and we have a lot of that movement between the Turkish state, between Turkey and Syria, where a lot of the individuals that actually left the West and went to fight with the Islamic State, they've actually entered Syria and Iraq through Turkey. So it's a very complicated political situation.
Indeed,
where
yeah.
Where on one end they do want the revenue, they do want the political clout that comes with them dealing with ISIS, and yet at the same time they want to preserve their border and preserve the state. Because if you look at Turkey, there's a tradition of veering, if you veer too much away from the secularist policies that were originally promoted by Ataturk, the first sort of leader of modern Turkey, the military would intervene, overthrow the government, use emergency powers in order to restore, quote unquote, the policies that they see fit, and essentially handing the power back to civilians. And it's really a cycle in Turkey over the last 100 or so years. It's been a cycle where that has always happened. It's sort of a revolving door between secularist governments and military style dictatorships that take over in order to restore the basic practices, or what they see as the important basic practices of the Turkish state.
I definitely want to have you back on to talk about more Middle East issues. But for now, with our concentration on ISIS, how does Israel fit into it? Is it in Israel's best interest to, and again, very broad term, and I know is highly incorrect, but is it in Israel's best interest to have Arabs fighting Arabs?
I've heard that a lot, but I don't think it's in anyone's interest to have ISIS, grow further in the region. I think, I think, you know, I think, that term where Arabs are fighting Arabs, I mean, it doesn't really fit because we don't really have Arabs fighting Arabs here. It's not as simple as that. It's essentially we have. I mean, ISIS can play a very important, threatening role to the stability of the Israeli state. If they actually are able to grow a bit more, they would actually, be at the borders of Israel, because Syria shares a border with Israel, and if they grow enough, they would actually be at the border with Israel. And I
Why
don't
has
think,
it not? Why has it not attacked Israel or Saudi Arabia? Why has it concentrated largely in Iraq and Syria?
I don't know, anything that we say might, it would be speculation. I don't know what goes on in their heads.
Yeah.
But they've actually made a number of threats against Israel since they came. And many have asked this question, but I think they know, that if they were to attack Israel, the response would be it would be much harsher than the response against them currently is, because, the second they would threaten Israel, they will actually receive, tenfold the reaction that they are currently receiving from NATO and other states in the region. So I think that's really the reason why they haven't attacked Israel. They're not really dumb. They know that if they were to attack Israel, the response would be much more magnified, and they wouldn't be able to survive. But they've actually made a number of threats against Israel, and they said our objective is to eventually overthrow Israel. And actually, in this, if you look at some of the interviews that have been conducted by people who are fighting with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, they've said our objective is to one day put the ISIS flag and raise it up on the White House. So I think it's in the long-term military strategy somehow is to attack Israel, or at least that's in the back of their heads. They say we are going to attack Israel one day, but we have to be stronger.
Will end.
I hope.
Yeah.
I hope not.
Yeah. Indeed. We'll end for now with this question. The Western response has largely been through airstrikes and bombing. Ultimately, and neither of us are Air Force generals, God knows, but will it work? Does there need to be more? Does there need to be boots on the ground? If you had to hypothesize a strategy to contain or eliminate ISIS, what would it involve?
Well, actually, this is a question that I've been thinking about since the airstrikes began. Actually, since the arrival of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And one of the things that we really have to pay attention and concentrate upon is really it goes out to the root of what is ISIS doing and where are they from and who are you eliminating.
Right.
And one of the big fundamental problems or the reasons that I have fundamental problem with the fact that ISIS is being bombed in the way it is being bombed is this or it feels to me at least that there is a misunderstanding of what is ISIS by political leaders, and by even the military brass in the West or by NATO. Because who are we really bombing? And ISIS as a movement has become grassroots. When they entered Mosul, as I was saying, historically speaking, since 2003, you had many elements in society in Mosul supporting a sort of fundamentalist form of Islam. And they were actually excited when ISIS came in. I mean, I can't say everybody in Mosul is or was, but a large chunk of the population was excited by the prospect of having non-Shias rule the population. And they actually were jubilant early on when they entered Mosul, ISIS entered Mosul. The population in Mosul was jubilant that they actually were going to get rid of the Shia regime that is based in Baghdad. They were able to get rid of sort of what they saw as the harsh political and social retribution that the Shia population was doing to them as a punishment for what they had done or how they controlled power since the emergence of the Iraqi state in 1921-22. And so the sort of the members of ISIS are not, this is not a normal military where they're actually fighting another normal military. These are grassroots movements. So, you kill 10 today, 20 will emerge tomorrow to revenge what these 10 were doing or how these 10 were killed. So to actually stand around and say we are going to bomb ISIS, my first question would be, who are you bombing? I mean, who in society are you bombing? What is ISIS? And yes, there are the armed elements of ISIS, but the armed elements of ISIS are one of some of the small blip of a larger organization that is supportive of this political movement.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, if you really read, we have accounts of individuals that have escaped from Mosul or were able to leave the city, and we have some interviews that were conducted with them. You see that ISIS has done an amazing job at winning the hearts and minds of people in Mosul, for example, at Raqqa in Syria, where they actually have garbage collection that is regularly ongoing. They actually were able to manage some of the issues that were really, really contribute to the instability of daily life in Mosul. They've actually managed to eliminate those by inserting themselves and by their ability to bring sort of essentially guarding the population from attacks, from bombings. So even checkpoints that were prevalent in Iraq, and particularly in Mosul in the period when before ISIS, that really encumbered the movement to people in the city. All these checkpoints and all these issues have been removed, and people are now able to move around the city in much more streamlined fashion and much better than when ISIS was not in control. So when we put all of these things together, which I'm sure, political leaders know about this, then who are we bombing? And if we are bombing them, are we really eliminating them, or are we just, removing the political elements of ISIS out? But really, the population that supported them are still there. And ISIS is doing an amazing job at inserting themselves inside the population. They're intermarrying, they're producing children, they're change the curriculums in schools to promote their propaganda and to promote their political views. They're not just a fighting force that's being resisted from the inside. On the contrary, actually, there's a lot of support for them on the inside.
As a wise man said, we're always prepared to fight the last war. Fadi, thank you ever so much for coming on to Thoughts, Comments, Opinions. And as I say, I want to have you back on real soon because we've barely touched the narrow surface of all this. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Once again, I'd like to thank our guest, Fadi Dawood, for informing us about ISIS and the Middle East. And to repeat what I said at the top of the show, if you have an idea for a topic or for a guest that you'd like to hear on Thoughts, Comments, Opinions, we would love your input. In the meanwhile, I hope that you do come and visit our archive at www.patreon.com, or you can also visit our website at www.doangelsbreathe.wordpress.com. And so, after all that, we'll be back with another podcast later in the week with the author Kelly Crichton, and we have more lined up for next week as well. So, from all of us who work the late shift here in beautiful Ireland, good night, everybody. Be seeing you.